Assalamu alaikum and welcome to the Politics and Media Show with me, Salma Yaqub. In the first half of today's show, we're going to be discussing the Human Rights Act in the light of comments made by Home Secretary Theresa May last week at the Conservative Party conference. She called for the entire Act to be scrapped. May criticised the Act for allowing for perverse outcomes. She says it's been used by foreign criminals in order to stay in the country. However, she's been strongly criticised for referring to a case in which a pet cat was supposedly used by an illegal immigrant to avoid deportation under the Human Rights Act. The cat was in fact not pivotal to the case, and the comments have reignited the discussion on the subject. Well, before I introduce today's guests, let's take a look at some of the background to the Human Rights Act.
The Human Rights Act was created in 1998 and enshrines the fundamental rights and freedoms contained in the European Convention on Human Rights. The need for such legislation grew out of the need to protect rights and freedoms in the wake of the horrors of the Second World War, but its implementation in the UK has often been the subject of controversy. Some have argued that it allows for perverse outcomes, such as foreign criminals remaining in the UK after claiming their human rights would be breached if they were sent home. One critic is Home Secretary Theresa May, who used her speech at the Conservative Party conference to call for the entire Act to be scrapped. One of the examples May used to illustrate her points was of an illegal immigrant who cannot be deported because he had a pet cat. It subsequently turned out that the pet cat in question wasn't pivotal to the case, and the Home Secretary has been heavily criticised, even from fellow cabinet ministers. But May has since said she doesn't regret using the cat example. It was one case among many, and I cited others in my speech, which showed the importance of this government doing something about the immigration rules to ensure that we're able to deport foreign criminals who we don't believe should be here. I used an example where an immigration judge had, as part of his decision that somebody could not be deported, cited the fact that the individual had brought a cat with their partner as a sign of the quality of their family life. I cited other cases as well, underlining this was a very important issue, which is our ability to deport foreign criminals. Many disagree though. Human rights campaigners believe it's one of many misrepresentations of the truth surrounding the Act. Britain has long championed the law, which among many things is intended to safeguard the right to education, safety, a family life, religious freedoms, the right to peaceful protest and to a fair trial. Defenders of the Act argue that if it was scrapped, then instead of cases being heard in the UK courts, people would have to go all the way to the European courts in Strasbourg if they wish to challenge a decision.
Well, with me to discuss some of the issues raised in that clip are Clive Baldwin from Human Rights Watch, a Senior Legal Advisor. Thank you very much for coming on the show.
Hello.
We're also joined by Sabi Dalu from One Society of Many Cultures. Thank you very much for joining us. And we have Ali Azim from the Conservative Party, an activist. Thank you for being with us today.
My pleasure.
Well, if I could come to you first, Clive, what objections would you have? We have Theresa May saying that we need to tighten up because there are too many foreign criminals getting away with it.
Well, on this particular issue of deportations of persons convicted of a criminal offence, there's two ways to go about it. One is to have a reasonable discussion within the framework of human rights, which is then you're talking about the balancing act. On one hand, what's someone being accused of, even convicted of? What are their remaining threats within the country? And on the other, what is their family life? So there's a world of difference between, say, someone convicted of rape who's only just arrived in the country, or someone cautioned for a very minor offence who's lived in the country for decades and is married and had a family. So you can have a discussion within that framework as to where the rights and wrongs should be. What Theresa May has been doing, as has some politicians in the past, is just use that for an all-out attack on the very idea of human rights. And that's very worrying, and Britain is the only country that we're aware of where that actual attack on human rights as a concept is taking place.
If I can come to you, clearly you're going to be defending the party line here. What possible defence could there be for trying to do away with human rights? That's something surely we are proud of in this country.
Well, absolutely. I think the first thing that we really got to get over is this idea of it's either the Human Rights Act or nothing, and that's not what at all we're saying here. I mean, if we look at the Human Rights Act, you know, year on year we've seen it being effectively you know, used incorrectly, and for the large part that's been the problem.
What do you mean by used incorrectly? Because even by the words of the Act itself,
Sure.
it says, as long as the safety and security of the country is put first, the health of the nation. So all of those provisions are already in the Act. So what abuse are you referring to?
Exactly. Well, no, I think you've hit the nail on the head there. If we look at Article 8, Section 2, you're quite right. It does say quite clearly that the safety of the country needs to, be taken into consideration. Unfortunately, year on year, despite that being one of the provisions in the Act itself, that what we're seeing is cases where people are using the Act as a means of staying in the country when clearly they shouldn't. Now, what I think, going back to your original point, which was, is it the Human Rights Act, or are we going to do away with human rights? Obviously, that's not what we're talking about. What the Conservative Party actually is largely pushing forwards is the concept of a British Bill of Rights. And the reason for why a British Bill of Rights makes sense is actually because, one, it would be decided on by the people who are British themselves, and it'll be, the government is democratically elected, whereas we don't have that same aspect with the human, the ECHR. We just don't have that. And also it means that, if anything, we can try to reverse the erosion of civil liberties that occurred under the Labour government and try to reel some of that back in. So if anything, it'll more than likely be a HRA plus rather than no HRA, and I think that's the key point to get across.
Well, we're also joined on the line by Sagir Hussain, who's also a lawyer. How would you respond to that? Is this a defence against the erosion of civil liberties, or is this actually erosion of civil liberties itself? Hello, are we still joined by Sagir on the line? I'm not sure whether we've got him now. Okay, well, we'll come back to him later. If I can come back to yourself, Sabi, how would you respond? Is this actually defending civil liberties, or is it actually attacking civil liberties, what Theresa May is proposing?
Well, I would say, as it stands, it is an attack on civil liberties, because whilst a so-called British Bill of Rights is being proposed, we haven't seen any form of the content of this, or what it would entail. So there's no information on that. Secondly, as your footage showed, the Human Rights Act essentially incorporates the European Convention on Human Rights into British law, which does safeguard a number of fundamental human rights, including things like freedom of religion. And my concern would be, if one scraps the Human Rights Act, then it could pave the way for similar legislation in Britain to what we've seen in other European countries, with certain bans in some shape or form on religious dress. Maybe not a wholesale, niqab ban, for example, as they have in France, but already there are rumblings in some sort of quarters that there should be some form of bans on religious symbols in the workplace, and that sort of thing. And I think that's very worrying. And secondly, I'm concerned that, once again, immigration is just being used in the context of a very serious economic situation, a severe, downturn in the economy, the Great Recession, some people are calling it. It's not the first time in history where we've had a serious international economic crisis, and politicians and the media very quick to blame immigration. The same thing happened with the Jewish community in the Great Depression 1930s, and we see it happening now. I think it's no accident that you've got a serious economic crisis, and instead of providing solutions to the hardship that people are facing, the Tories think, okay, I know, let's bang the drum on immigration, and that'll shore up our voters.
I think distraction.
I do. I think it's a distraction, yeah, and it's a bit of a cynical attempt to sort of, distract people from the real issues and to, shore up the Conservative voters.
Okay, well, we've got Sagir Hussain now on the line. I'm afraid he hasn't been able to hear some of our discussion up till now. But Sagir, what do you make of Theresa May's attack on the Human Rights Act? And do you think this may actually be quite dangerous in terms of politicians interfering with what should be an independent judiciary?
Well, this is our concern. I mean, at cage prisoners, we deal with cases which have serious political implications and obviously have made a sea change in the way the law has been implemented in this country over the last 10, 12 years. Hence the phrase that there's a lot of draconian terrorism laws that come into place. Now, our concern is that we want the judiciary to be totally independent from any pressure from government. An independent judiciary is a cornerstone of a proper democracy where there's a separation of powers. And the fear is that the judges themselves are normal human beings with normal strengths and weaknesses, and they may feel that the pressure coming from the government over certain issues, and certainly when it comes to immigration, as your colleague your guest just mentioned a short while ago, and issues relating to politically motivated offences, which you may also call terrorism offences, may actually put too much pressure on the judges to, interpret the law in what we think is a fair manner. And that's really my concern here.
Clive, would you agree with that concern? You think this is political interference which is actually taking away a fundamental cornerstone of our justice system?
Yeah. Well, what's been clear since the Human Rights Act came in, brought in at the beginning of the Blair government, is that politicians don't like the power that it gives to, in some ways it gives to judges, but just judges to uphold these basic human rights. And let's remember, this is only necessary because Britain is one of the very few countries in the world without a written constitution. So in other countries you have constitutional rights, as in the United States, and there the judges have much more power. And there they can strike down laws under the Human Rights Act that can only declare law incompatible. But what we saw under the last government, under the Labour government, was, as has been mentioned, a major attack on basic civil liberties and the right to a fair trial, especially after September the 11th. And to begin with, it was those judges who, using the Human Rights Act, stood up to it and declared some of these laws incompatible. And it took many years before the politicians were brave enough to do so. So the defence of civil liberties in the last 10 years has been largely due to the Human Rights Act.
Well, Ali, can you understand some of the concerns here? Of course, it's more the vulnerable people who rely on the Human Rights Act to defend their basic human rights, and it's easy to have a pot shot in this way, isn't it?
Well, I think again we're still missing the point. I mean, Clive, you mentioned the fact that over the last 10 years we've seen a significant erosion of civil liberties. The Human Rights Act did not protect that. If you actually look at who did, it was people such as it was for example the Conservative Party pushing against the introduction of 42 days, or the extension to 90 days, and now hopefully bringing it down to 14 days. It was the scrapping of the ID cards, which was under the Conservatives. It was these sort of commitments to civil liberties that have actually helped keep our civil liberties intact, not the Human Rights Act.
But does it help, does it, when it seems like the Home Secretary is scaremongering, using cases which actually are based not on fact but on myth? It surely undermines the case itself, and it shows how dangerous, in fact, it is to leave these things in the hands of politicians.
Well, I mean, fact or myth, I mean, that's still a debate that's being had.
Well, Kenneth Clarke himself came out and very much
But
attacked
I think
the
point is it's not to get tied up on a specific case about a cat. I think that's actually detracting from the entire issue altogether.
Well, she chose to use it to
but
say
this is
proof of what I'm saying.
She used multiple examples, though, didn't she? I mean, Nick Clegg himself also made an example about a chap on the roof who requested or insisted he needed KFC, and having fried chicken is not a human right, and the
Human Rights Act doesn't say that it is a right.
Precisely,
so again, that's a silly example to give. That exactly makes the point that people are exaggerating and using examples where, of course, ordinary people can say, "Well, that doesn't sound right."
But that's precisely how the Human Rights Act was used, and I think
it was not used in that way. That's the point.
In that instance, it was used for that reason. That's exactly what I'm saying. And actually, if you look at it, what I would say is the Human Rights Act has great intentions, and I think nobody disagrees with what's being said there. The issue is about implementation, or the incorrect type of implementation that's happened, which has led to these few examples. And to be honest, I'm not necessarily in favour of giving out the extreme examples, but generally speaking, there have been a lot of misuses of the HRA, and not enough consideration for what we spoke about earlier about Article 8, Section 2, and the way that should be implemented.
So it's a question. You're really criticising the judges then, not just the Act. And these are British judges who are coming to these conclusions. So are you now going to do away with the judges then?
No,
if you're saying the Act itself does provide for that balance, saying it has to, the needs of the individual have to be balanced against the needs of society. It's already there in the Act. So why do you need to get rid of the Act?